Peace and Black Power. Welcome to another edition of BABATV, Every Time Fire, House of Consciousness, and it's always my privilege to be in the company of my esteemed elder brother Tehuti. I'm so happy to be with him always and back in DC. There's a lot going on, and whenever a whole lot is going on, I always come to get guidance and wisdom, as we all should, from our elders, as to, give us some more insight and as to what's going on and how we can plan for the future and stay out of the traps that have been geared toward us for so many thousands of years. Brother Tehuti, my first question would be, let's talk about President Trump, Donald Trump. We were talking a little bit about him earlier, and I don't even want to just go in on him.
Okay. Donald John Trump is a very despicable person. And the irony is that we're living in an age where we can see the worst of the American citizen rise to the level of its presidency. I always thought that Andrew Jackson had the #1 spot because of his betrayal of the Native American peoples of this land. But Donald Trump surpasses him in being a very despicable, low-life, non-moral person. And he is the president of the United States. But his presidency is an indication, in my opinion, of the state of mind of white America. That is, white America could not get over the fact that in 2008, the people of the United States elected Barack Obama as president. So after 8 years of the Obama presidency, the white folks retaliated against the political system by electing an outsider. Not only was Donald Trump not a quote-unquote Republican, but he was outside of politics, but they elected him, and with the language, the behavior patterns, that was all exposed, but they elected him anyway because they would rather have a man who would, in his campaign phrase, take America back to where it was great again. And the irony of that is his companion that's running for Senate from Alabama, this guy Judge Moore, who just stated, I guess it was Wednesday or Thursday of this week, that America was great again back when their families was together, in slavery. So when white America enjoyed slavery, and what he should have said is from the end of slavery all the way up through 1965, during the period of the Jim Crow era of America, that's what they consider America being great. The white man on top enjoying all of the privileges of what the country's slogans are and keeping everybody else oppressed. But what we know is from the very beginning, these people, starting with the Pilgrims in 1619 or 1620, when they landed at Plymouth Rock to start what became the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the fact that they almost died and were saved by the Native Americans. That's what their Thanksgiving holiday is supposed to be all about. But here are people who made a promise, gave their word of honor to these native peoples, all right, that in exchange for saving them, they would live in peace and harmony with them. But what did they do? Like a few years later, they imported blankets with smallpox on it to spread biological genocide against these native people to drive them off of their land. As they spread further and further west, they signed more and more treaties with the native people saying, okay, we'll draw the line here. These lands that you're on are yours until the end of time, and we're going to stay on this land. But every time they did that, they waited until they got more and more immigrants, built their armies up stronger, and they kept marching over the peoples that they had made signed these treaties with, making a promise. So the Native American, in their history, the one thing that they know for sure, that other immigrant peoples don't fully understand to this day. Now, we as black people should fully understand it. The Native Americans definitely understand it, that the white man really has no morals. He has no word that you can take anywhere seriously, except when he talks about death and destruction. But here's a man now in the presidency of the United States who represents all the lies, the backstabbing, the double dealing, the forked tongue speaking of the white man since he's been on this continent. So when I think about Donald J. Trump, I think he is a summation of 400 years of the Eurocentric peoples being on this continent, and the string of broken promises where they gave their word of honor, just a string of broken promises they have made until they took this continent. They continued as the white man left Europe. In terms, there were peoples living where they were living all over the globe. But starting in the 1500s, who left their homeland to go out conquering the rest of the world until they could bring it under their control. And under their control is where they have the world today. The economic system that they developed controls the world. The leaders of the world, if you take, with the exception of the Chinese people, and to some extent with the exception of the people of India, you have complete white control of the globe, based on their values. And their values are take, control, accumulate wealth, and conquer people, and subordinate the rest of the world's people to their ideas. That's what I think of Donald J. Trump. He's a symbol, of the illness of the people of this land. He's a symbol of the illness of the men who created this country. Again, a lot of our people will talk about all of the wonderful words that's in their Constitution, that's in their Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But they just meant all English men. They didn't mean all men. Because as other immigrants came to the country, the Irish wasn't considered equal to the English when they came here. The Italians wasn't considered equal to the English when they came here. I really hate to say it, but those segments of European populations knew that as they came to America, they found themselves subordinate to the English, who ran this country. Eventually, they have been able to assimilate into white America, but they had to do it in steps. Just like the white woman. When the white man said that all men are created equal, he definitely didn't mean to add women to that phrase. In fact, his woman didn't get anywhere near equality at all until relatively very recently. They got the right to vote during the 20th century, about I forgot which amendment it was that gave the white woman the right to vote. And then black women still had to struggle and fight to get the right to vote. Right now in Congress, these women on Capitol Hill are all exposing white men who've been doing what they've been doing their whole existence, sexually harassing their women. And now they are telling on them as such. But people are looking at this as if it's something brand new or as if they're surprised. But this has been the behavior of the white man here in Washington, D.C. during the entire entity of Washington, D.C.'s existence. So it's nothing really new, but it's like one of the female reporters said on one of the programs over the last 2 days. I think she's Andrea Mitchell from the NBC News networks. She said even back in the 1980s when Clarence Thomas was being nominated for the Supreme Court, she and other reporters knew that kind of stuff was going on Capitol Hill because it had happened to her, it happened to other people that she knew, it happened to other staff members on Capitol Hill that she knew, but they had nobody to tell it to. Who were they going to tell it to? But for some odd reason today, after the Donald Trump's exposure on Access Hollywood with Billy Bush riding on the bus, talking about his escapades, an era has opened where white women feel secure in telling on these people in power who have been harassing them or using their position as senators, as congressmen, or whatever in order to exploit women for sexual purposes. But the big question that no one has asked is this: how many of these white women advanced through their jobs and reached the levels that they reached by going along with what these white men was asking of them? Yeah, you've got some complaining today, but a whole lot of women are in the place where they are because of their acquiescing and giving in to the request for sex from some of these men. So that's just to show you how sick the country is, and it's just coming out on all levels. And one last thing about Donald Trump, if I may. What's even more explosive, or as explosive as these sexual escapades being exposed today, is the fact that Donald Trump used the old tail wag the dog move that Bill Clinton used. In fact, they even made a Hollywood movie about it. When a president got caught doing something wrong, he started a war in order to get the public's attention off of his behavior so they would just look at the war. Well, Donald Trump is using this thing by recognizing Jerusalem as the unequivocal capital of Israel as a tactic to take pressure or to take eyes away from the fact that this special prosecutor is about to indict everybody that had something to do with connections between him and his son and Russia. And see, and the ball is about to crash down on these people. And so as a distraction to try to get the American people's mind away from this negative behavior that he engaged in order to get to the White House, he's trying to just set up what we call a straw man, an issue on the side. Now, the rest of the quote-unquote civilized white world, all right, are all rejecting what he did. That is England, France, Italy, Germany. Everybody is saying, no, 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 no. They're not recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But Donald Trump went out there on the limb as a tactic, not that there's anything substantive from it. And I would bet my life on the fact that there will not come a day when the United States actually builds a new embassy building in Jerusalem. Their embassy is in Tel Aviv and is probably going to stay there.
Talk to me a little bit, well, as extensive as I know that you can. I don't know how deep you want to go. Hopefully you'll go deep. Libya and the relationship, the historical relationship between the Arabs and the African people and its ratio and proportion, relatively speaking, to today.
Okay. Well, the historical record, if we go back, there's a time when there were no quote-unquote Arabs in Africa. Africa was for Africans, and that's who lived there. Now, because of what they call the Northern Bridge, that is that landmass from Egypt into what is Western Asia, where Arabia and most of the Arab peoples are today, because of that land bridge, peoples moved back and forth across that land bridge. But the ancient Libyans were black people. They weren't Arab peoples. But as with the Arab invasion of North Africa, with the spread of Islam, a lot of the Arabs who invaded stayed. And they stayed from Egypt all the way across to Morocco. It is where they stayed. In fact, in most of those instances, if we use the American definition, because of conquest and the behavior of men, a lot of those Arab men, of course, had sexual relations through conquest with the black women there and produced what we actually have is kind of a mixed race of people. I hate using the term, but you've heard of I won't use the real negative term, but you heard of the sand Negro? Well, that's a term that white people invented in the description of the Arabs. That is, they weren't quote-unquote pure white people. Therefore, they are mixed race people, so they call them sand Negroes as such. But from approximately 700 AD on the European timeline up to today, there's been a mixture of peoples across North Africa. That's those that are called Arabs. But a lot of people confuse the term Arab with Muslim. because, for example, the Iranian people are also Muslim by religion. But Iran is even the name Iran comes from the ancient word Aryan, and they consider themselves white people. These are white people who adopted Islam. They are not Arabs. In fact, the big fight between Iran and Saudi Arabia is over the fact that you have white Muslims in Iran versus the mixed race Muslims in Saudi Arabia fighting for supremacy and domination of the religion as such. In the legends of Islam, of course, when the Prophet was first spreading his doctrine, he had to escape from Arabia, and where did he go? He went to Africa in order for safety, like in rebuilding his strength before he reinvaded and went back into Arabia. The Islam spread down from Egypt into Abyssinia, known today as Ethiopia, as such, and it spread down as far as what the country we know today as Somalia on the east coast of Africa. And as Islam spread across North Africa, it spread, as I said, from Egypt through Libya, through Algeria, through Tunisia, through Morocco, and even into part of what is known as Mauritania, that whole northern part of Africa in terms of the religion. So with the religion being in place, the Islamic Empire from approximately 700 through, I'm going to use the term 1492 for a very specific reason. 1492 is the date given for when the Queen Isabel and King Frederick of Andalusia organized their armies and finally chased the Moors out of Spain and Portugal. And with them being chased out, now Islam is no longer in Europe, but is confined to North Africa. And once it was confined to North Africa, Islam began to spread southwestward, that is down the western side of the African continent, and start spreading south, down through Mali, northern Niger, northern Nigeria, as what have you, right? It began to spread. And as it spread, another phenomenon was created. That is, anyone who didn't willingly accept Islam was considered an infidel. And just as the European expansion into the Western Hemisphere began, Islam is spreading southwestward, and it was because of that spread, a lot of Muslims became traders in people who hadn't accepted Islam and started selling them to the merchants who were bringing these Africans from the west coast of Africa into the Western Hemisphere, that is, into the Americas, the Caribbean island, and into South America. So again, Islam played a role in the slave trade on the West Coast. And most of the captives early in the slave trade, as they called it, were those non-Muslim captives that the Muslim armies had captured as they were spreading Islam to the southwestern coast of Africa. Now, we also know that early in Islam, in fact, as early as 800 A.D., that on the east coast of Africa, that the Muslims started capturing Africans and taking them into slavery and selling them into Arabia and in what we call the belly of that western part of Asia and to those countries there. So slavery in East Africa started as early as 800. It started in West Africa as early as 1440, and during that whole time period from 800 up through 1888 was the full period of Western slavery that some 400 million Africans were taken into captivity, killed in the wars. So Africa was depopulated by 400 million people. And what's interesting about that figure is that the population of the United States today is approximately 390 million people. So Africa was depopulated by more people during that time period than live in the continental United States today, just to show you the scope of how Africa was impacted by the capture and enslavement of African people. And it's just a fact of history. It's now, I can't apologize for it, but one of the main perpetrators of this slave trade were Muslims, and in some cases not just Arab Muslims or Iranian Muslims, but also African Muslims. Africans who were converted to the religion became the forefront of the armies that were capturing African people and selling them into captivity. So we've had a mixed relationship with Islam. As such, it hasn't been pretty. And in terms of looking at African countries today that are totally Islamic, look at the economic status of the people there and ask what is their status today, and has Islam really improved their state of affairs? And the answer is obvious. Of course it hasn't, because religion, unfortunately, has always been a tool that was created with good intentions, but in the long run, it had always brought death and destruction to peoples that have subordinated themselves to them, whether it's Christianity, Islam, and even Judaism. Have all been, all histories are full of war and conflict with other peoples. And you would think that the divine creator of the universe, if the divine creator of the universe wanted to send a message to the peoples of earth to follow a particular moral path, to lift themselves up as a civil people, that there would be no room for the death and destruction of their armies. There's a new TV series that just started, I think, called Nightfall or something of that nature, which is the story of the Knights Templar, where they're trying to clean up their act and retell that story as if these men were really warriors for God. Well, if you look at the number of people killed by the Knights Templar and the Crusaders in the Western Asia, not just around Jerusalem, but in Western Asia, North Africa, where these armies went, again, you would say, well, why in the world, how in the world, would a divine, benevolent, omnipotent force empower people to go out with so much death and destruction? Under the banner, the hidden banner of these beautiful sayings, both in the Judaic code, there's a moral drama in terms of the Ten Commandments, which gives a moral code to live by. Islam has a moral code in which to live by. Christianity has a moral code in which to live by. Yet none of the followers of the religions have adhered to the high moral codes. They've all engaged in the in wars against those who didn't accept what they have determined is a visitor from God himself inspired them to do as such. So I don't have a lot of positive things to say about the followers of doctrines that as they have been worked out within the confines of religion. I often tell people, when Christianity took over the Western world, the Christian world went into the Dark Ages. All right. So as the Catholic Church in 800 AD, I'm trying to remember the name of the particular William who established the Holy Roman Empire. Once the Holy Roman Empire was implemented, from that date forward, Europe is in the Dark Ages. And Europe doesn't begin to come out of the Dark Ages, doesn't reach what they call its Renaissance until after knowledge is taken back into Europe that has been obtained by some of these crusaders in North Africa and Jerusalem. And then they began to find out about mathematics and science and astronomy, and they began to come out of their darkness that was imposed on them by the doctrines of the Mother Church. And as the Europeans found out that everything this mother church had been telling them wasn't true, they not only go through a renaissance, then they go through a reformation. That is, they reform or reorganize Christianity. And for the first time, you have these protesters, that is, these people who were protesting the policies of the Catholic Church, began to form new forms of their church that are today called Protestants. So your Protestant Christians are Reformed Catholics, in other words, as such, right? And as Reformed Catholics, again, as they began to adopt these new policies, one of the reasons that the Puritans left England and the Netherlands and settled in Massachusetts because they wanted to go to a new place where they could implement the philosophy of Christianity as they interpreted it in a new place. And like I said, and once they got to this so-called New World and set up camp and had a difficult time surviving in it, and was aided and was taught the ways in which they could live on this continent, the natives taught them how to plant corn, taught them how to fish and do other things. And once they were secure in establishing their colony, one of the things that they turned around and did, or the peoples who came after them did, again, is to commit genocide against the people who saved their lives and who created the circumstances where they could survive in this Western Hemisphere. So religion as a whole, I don't think has served humankind very well, because, again, the nature of the people who are adopting this religion is such that their nature is not compatible with the moral code of the religions that they have designed. That is the nature of the European growing up in the cold of Northern Europe with fewer resources, a limited ability to farm. There were not a lot of fruit trees or vegetables and things growing freely, so they had to scrape and scuffle, like for food. It just that what that develops in you over a 1,000-year period is a type of mental attitude and a nature of conquest, as opposed to people growing up in or their civilizations developing in a temperate zone where foods are readily available, where they could grow and farm, and have a lot of resources. They have they have a different nature and more harmony. They live in harmony with the universe. Their music reflects the heartbeat of the globe itself and the peoples themselves. So you have two peoples with different kind of natures that ran into each other. And the people who have the harshest natures engaged in the most harsh activity of conquest as such. So these good Christian Europeans who came to the Western Hemisphere engaged in a conquest of the whole land of what we call the United States, whereas they made all of these promises as they were spreading west to the native people, signing peace treaties, giving their word of honor that they would stay on the one side of the line and the other peoples would live on the other side of the line. And unfortunately, the native peoples bought these misrepresentations of Europeans and find themselves here in 2017 totally subordinated, living on little patches called reservations, all right, as these people who came out of Western Europe have taken this whole land base. That just gives you an overview of the nature of the European.
Yeah, the next question, it kind of ties into what we've been talking about, is Muammar Gaddafi. What in light of the messed up relationship that Arabs have had with our people, and you see them chopping our people up over there today and stabbing us. I mean, just, and as you said, the Arabs were the first slave masters of our people. What did you have to say about Muammar Gaddafi and all of this? What was his relationship?
Good question. Well, let me start this way. I was stationed in Libya for a year and a half, 18 months before Gaddafi came to power. I got a chance to see firsthand how Libyans lived under King Idris. Now, here's a man, the king of Libya, who said all the oil in the country was his. It didn't belong to the country as such, right? And when Gaddafi came to power, with the coup d'etat overthrowing the king and took over, the Libyan people were liberated from a real despot king. And the country was elevated. He used the resources, the Libyan oil resources, to really upgrade and modernize a lot of the country. That was what he did for the Libyan people themselves. But in terms of Africans, especially after the African liberation movement is going on, one of the things that a lot of people don't know is Muammar Gaddafi gave more monies to African liberation struggles all over the continent than anybody else in Africa. That is, to the ANC, he gave monies to ZANU, he gave money to ZAPU, both liberation movements in what's today Zimbabwe. Again, the ANC and I can't think of the other, the more militant South African armies that were fighting against white apartheid. Gaddafi not just talked stuff, but he actually gave Libyan resources to the Africans and helped get them free from European control. That's one. He was one of the foremost proponents of the African Union. And in fact, he was he was one of the foremost proponents of what he called the United States of Africa. He wanted Africa to reorganize. And again, he put Libyan resources up front for that. That's the good part. The bad part, anybody who stays in power 30 years or so is probably going to go over a line of being a revered or enlightened leader and become a despot and holding on to power. But that doesn't answer the question of what has happened since the American and French governments participated in destroying the country and getting him assassinated to get him out of power. Now, I say they got him out of power because the Western world still does not want to see a united Africa. Right now, the European powers, the French, the British, the Italians to some degree, the Germans to some degree, are all still enjoying the benefits of the rape of Africa of her natural resources. And what would have prevented that would be a new political paradigm on the African continent. Instead of these 54 individual countries struggling, trying to survive, having a united, kind of like a federated government organizing themselves, would be a much more intelligent way to move forward. And if one of the voices that was pushing that had a lot of resources that he was dedicating to that purpose, they had to get him out of the way. And so Gaddafi was assassinated. And what's been left in the aftermath? No type of leadership at all. And so we get down to the basic, when you get down to your basic Arab tribes in Libya, now they are fighting for themselves. And one of the things that they see as an impediment to their development are the number of Africans, what we call black Africans, moving up from south of the Sahara, trying to get up to the Mediterranean and make their way into Europe. They see these people as an impediment to their own progress. Therefore, these different Arab tribes or Libyan tribes are engaged in genocidal tactics against black Africans. It's an absolute fact. And some of the scenes that we see reported, are real. And it is a shame. There's no way that I could, ever want to try to justify what's going on. But part of the problem, though, is the fact is how much Africa is destabilized south of what they call the Sahara. The attacks in Niger, the spread of Islam in Niger, in northern Nigeria, like that spreading down the west coast, is a disruptive force. And say what you will, again, for one, to have a religion that says it is peace, excuse the expression, it is peace, and that it comes in peace, to have so much disruption and murder going on. There's something wrong with either what the people are reading or what they are believing about what the scriptures actually say. So I don't justify what they're doing. It's abhorrent, and I wish there was a way that a force could come in and wipe these people out that are just unwantonly killing black folk in the vicious way that they are killing them. Not just in Libya. To see what one of the groups in Western Mali, is doing, to non-Islamic Africans who live in Mali. It's atrocious what they're doing in Niger. Again, where there are weak governments, and you just have these small, what I call those small military establishments, where you have a former military officer has taken over a country, and it's just he and his boys that are enjoying the fruits of the monies that are coming in. The people are weak. The armies are not well trained. They can't really defend the country. And what you have is a disruptive, uncivil substructure that permeates the western part of Africa, where you have countries that have a lot of resources, like Nigeria as an example, that with all of the resources in Nigeria, to this date, though politically there's not a lot of military type fighting going on, there's still not a lot of unity in the country. Again, the Islamic part of the country, the other parts of the country, the tribal chiefs are still supreme. You have people fighting over resources because there's no long-term plan for development. And what resources that are in the country are being ripped off. In fact, if there was a way to get the big banks of Europe to divulge the accounts of the African leadership, past and present, that have millions of dollars, billions of dollars in personal wealth in European banks that they have ripped off from the country. If the Africans were able to repatriate that money and bring that back into their own economies, a lot of the continental economic woes would disappear almost overnight. But again, these European banks, especially the Swiss bank accounts, and there are other countries that participate just as well, they know that these African leaders are storing monies away in their banks, and the reason that they won't do anything about it, because it gives France, it gives Switzerland, it gives them economic stability having all of this African money in their bank accounts. See, and they're able to use that money piled up there for their own purposes. And these individuals, these families, and these individuals who have either been overthrown or are still in power, and they have their sons in Europe getting European educations and what have you, been storing all of the monies there. And most African peoples are not benefiting, especially in countries like Nigeria, they're not benefiting from the oil wealth, because there are Africans who are benefiting from that oil wealth, who are stealing monies from that oil wealth and have it stashed away outside of the country. That's part of what's wrong there on the continent. So going back to where we started with Gaddafi and the Arab problem, again, Gaddafi wasn't a problem. In fact, Kwame Nkrumah, I'm sorry, not Kwame Nkrumah, I beg your pardons, Sékou Touré from Guinea, and other more revolutionary leaders from the African liberation struggle were all quite respectful of Gaddafi because of the monies that he gave to the various African liberation movements. Again, the brothers in South Africa probably wouldn't be free today. I can guess that, because if they had to just rely on just their own monies, the monies that arm the brothers in South Africa a lot of that monies came from Libya. The monies that helped arm Mugabe and his ZANU army, the Zimbabwe African National Union, and there was also a Zimbabwe. Now, it was called ZAPU. Forgive me for not being able to spell out what the acronym actually means, but there were liberation struggles, and they needed monies, they needed arms. The Rhodesians weren't about to go into any type of peace accord with the brothers who wanted equality in their own countries. The only way they got it was through armed struggle. Botha and the various leaders of South Africa, especially from 1947 up through the 1980s, none of that leadership was ready to sit down at a peace table and work out an equitable sharing of the wealth of South Africa until the brothers had an army, went into exile and was training, like in Angola and other places, and they knew that armies was coming. And the only reason that they settled and signed any type of peace accord was because they didn't want to get wiped out. And so the monies to purchase the arms, to give the liberation armies the strength to pose a real threat to white rule, came from sources like Omar Gaddafi. So he I respect. What's going on today in the aftermath of his assassination? Yeah, there are unruly tribal groups that are engaged in genocidal practices over anybody who doesn't look like them. And in the case of the difference between a Libyan, and what we call a black African, I hate using that terminology, but it's quite obvious when you see a brother coming up and he doesn't look like you. And these people are not being very kind, even though in some cases Libya has been used as a point of departure for a lot of the brothers trying to make it across the Mediterranean to get into Southern Europe in order to look for what they call a better way of life for themselves. But I don't support what's going on, and I think what they are doing should be condemned in the most harsh terms that we can create to point out that that is a negative. And if these people ever want to rejoin the world society of humanity, they must stop those type of practices.
Before I don't want to forget him, Robert Mugabe, and what's going on with him, the money that he was offered, the golden handshake. We're gonna give you a golden handshake, and so many, I think hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I met Robert Mugabe in 1980. After their victory, he was here in the United States, and in fact, he came to Howard University and had an audience with those of us that were from the All African People's Revolutionary Party under the leadership at that time of Kwame Ture. We had a meeting in Crampton Auditorium, and an address from Robert Mugabe. During their war against the white Rhodesians, one of the small things that we in the party did here in the United States was raise monies and sent monies to ZANU to help with their liberation struggle against the white government there. So he met with us. I got a chance to shake his hand and the whole thing. So Robert Mugabe was a hero of mine in the 1980s, and I thought he was an educated man, well versed in what needed to be done to take control of the country and put the country on the right path for the upward development of the peoples of Zimbabwe. However, there's an old saying that I think applies in this case, where it's something like power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And when you have absolute power over a period of time, that not only is it corruptive, it corrupts you. And I think in the last years of his presidency, Robert Mugabe became corrupt and was about himself, his family, and the top generals around him. Again, I think that if the peoples of Zimbabwe are able to find the banks where all the money is stashed outside of Zimbabwe, you're going to find out just how much wealth was wasted and accumulated by a handful of peoples. It's not that they are living in all of this luxury in Zimbabwe, but it appears to me that all of these guys put away a nest egg in a European bank in case they get overthrown, where after their rule they can go off someplace and still live high on the hog, as the saying goes. He had some good policies. I think he was correct in stating to the people of Zimbabwe that the Rhodesian settlers came in and took the land and kept on the land by means of strength and corruption, and not by means of acquiring the land justly. Therefore, he was correct. They didn't need to be the owners of any land in Zimbabwe. If they would sign a pledge of allegiance to the country and agree to work with Africans and share, like to teach them the correct farming processes of how to farm, how to harvest, how to get the most return on their work efforts, it would have been something different. But these people were hell-bent on maintaining the wealth that they had accumulated for themselves, maintaining their farms, and continue to accumulate the wealth just for themselves, and in many cases were cheating the government out of monies that they owed them. So when the time came for an expansion of the Zimbabwean peoples to take fuller advantage of the resources of their country, I think Mugabe and ZANU did the right thing with the decisions that they made to repatriate the land from those white Rhodesian settlers. So I had no problem with that. The problem that I have, I think, in all cases, as I said earlier, if you stay in office too long, you say, hey, it's like an old fish. Pull a fish out of the river, for the first couple of days, it's fresh and you can eat it. But after a week or so, that fish begins to stink and it's no longer any good. And any leadership that stays in place just for its own sake, it reaches a point where it's no longer any good. And in Mugabe's case, things, in my opinion, really turned bad when he turned around and married that younger woman. See, I think she was something 30, 40 years younger than him. And then as the people, it reached the point where the people saw where she was trying to position herself to take over the government after after Mugabe stepped down. And that reached a point when they fired the vice president, Mugabe's vice president, and it looked like she was moving, that the army made the intelligent and wise decision that it was time to end the Mugabe reign. And I don't know what type of golden parachute they gave him to force him to step down, but I do understand that it was an economic incentive given him, which aided in his decision that instead of him being taken out on the beach and shot like the Tobots were in Liberia, 35, 40 years ago, he took the choice of being able to stay in country and still live a high economic lifestyle as the past president without worried about being assassinated. So, but the people of Zimbabwe have a unique chance and opportunity to move forward under their new leadership. And I just hope for their sake that they're able to understand that every few years they need to have an election, and new leadership coming up from the people is the best type of leadership that a country can have.
You went into it a little bit briefly in the beginning, but talk a little bit more about Trump and him putting the American embassy over there in Jerusalem. What the hell is he trying to do?
Okay, well, again, in my opinion, the act itself is a desperation act to try to take attention away from his moral behavior and the closeness of this special counsel to getting ready to send his son and some more people to prison for what they did during this past election to put him in the White House. But see, you have to look at, in terms of Israel, you can never just look at what's going on today when we're talking about Israel. Here is a country that was created in the 20th century based on the legend and mythology, of a religion as such. I mean, to this date, there's still a debate in terms of who the original Israelites were. And are these Israelis descended from these Israelites? Or is it true that in 754 AD, as part of the Khazarian Empire, that when their king adopted Judaism as his personal religion and dictated that all the subjects of his kingdom, Khazaria, would become Jews, that this is when the European, the white man, became a Jew. See, today, these people are claiming a legacy based on the writings, again, of an Old Testament, claiming the legacy of these ancient, what we call Hebrew Israelites, in terms of who they were. People who had allegedly been held in captivity in the Nile Valley for an unknown number of years. But allegedly, as the story goes, and here's the story, that you have a guy named Jacob, all right, and famine comes to the area of Western Asia where he's living. So he and his 11 sons, all right, decide to migrate out of this famine condition down into the Nile Valley, where his 12th son, Joseph, is living and is an advisor to the Pharaoh. Now, after being there for so many years, now we're just dealing with 72 people went in. 72 people go in into this situation. But as the legend or the story is blown up, it comes a time when there's a leader among the Nile Valley civilization peoples named Moses, who comes along and through a battle back and forth with the king of the Nile Valley, he gets to liberate these people and set them free. So 144,000 people who had been living under some type of circumstances in Egypt, whether as they went in as just travelers who were allowed to stay on the land and live on the land. Now, the way the story turns out, then they said they were made slaves and were forced to help build some of the ancient cities of the Nile Valley. And allegedly, this Moses character comes along and liberates them from this situation. We know how that story goes. So you have some 144,000 people that leave the Nile Valley in this exodus. And these 144,000 people are divided into 12 groups in order for identification purposes. And these 12 groups are based on the names out of their language for the 12 constellations of the zodiac as such. And so these 12 tribes, as they are now called, right, of 12 tribe confederated people leave the Nile Valley and go, or after wars in and out and around the land, they settle on the land in what was called Canaan. And over a time period, this land becomes Palestine, all right, when the Romans get there. Now, allegedly under the Romans, in 70 A.D., the remnants of these people were wiped out because of this battle, and others of them were scattered to the four winds of the universe. Nobody knows what happened to them, all right? So here we have some 700 years later, these people telling their story as opposed to being ethnically the Hebrew Israelites that left the Nile Valley and lived in Palestine. Now they become Ashkenazis, all right, out of Khazaria, all right, and they take the religion and claim it for themselves. Now, after taking this religion and claiming it for themselves, then they want to claim a right to go back and occupy the land where the legend where they lived after their exodus from the Nile Valley takes place, all right? So for many years, they have this idea in mind, but it's not until the late 1800s when a political movement called Zionism is developed. I think the guy's name was Herzl. And this whole idea, Herzl in league with a guy named Cecil Rhodes, who had established that white folks need to control the African continent from Cape Town to Cairo, was his motto, all right, and such. And now they want to occupy Palestine as theirs. And they began a process dealing with the British government, whom at that time, I think Palestine was their colony. So for all of World War I and World War II, these European Ashkenazi Jewish people practicing this religion have a desire that they want to go somewhere and live in a homeland. Because of the military strategy of Adolf Hitler and his German regime, in which they actually committed genocide against millions of these people and tried to wipe them out. I mean, in Poland, in Austria, in Germany itself. What happened to these people is a world tragedy, I will admit that. And they really increased their pressure of wanting to get out of Europe and have a homeland somewhere. A lot of people might not remember, but one of the places that they begged the European government and Britain that they wanted to go was what was the British colony of Uganda. And to justify going to Uganda under this quote-unquote Zionist ideology, they claimed that Uganda was the literal place of the Garden of Eden. And therefore, since they were descended from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they wanted Britain to give them the colony of Uganda, and that's where they were going to create the new Israel, in the colony of Uganda. But the British didn't buy that one. So during the course in the fighting of World War II, what ended up happening is a lot of them who fled Europe set their goal on Palestine. All right, and they wanted Palestine to become the new Jewish homeland. And in conjunction with the British government, especially after they fought in Palestine for many years against the British Army. In fact, one of the biggest tragedies in the land of Palestine occurred at what I think it was called the King David Hotel, where a man who would eventually become one of the prime ministers of this new country of Israel committed an act of genocide against the British government and blew up the King David Hotel and killed many, many, many British soldiers. But anyway, Britain decided to get out of the area and end up granting to these European Jews the Palestine for their new homeland in 1947, and when they established the state of Israel as such. Right, that's when Israel, the modern country, is invented. About 1947. I think I'm off. If I'm off by a year or two, it's during that time period. But since the late 1940s, these Europeans, when I'm talking about white people, who converted to this religion of Judaism, has tried to establish and convince the rest of the world that this land base of Palestine is their ancient home, and therefore they deserve to have a country there. But also part of what drives them is the genocide that was committed against them by Hitler during the World War II time period. And the fact that the United States has a guilty complex because a great big steamship or boat full of European Jews trying to escape Hitler tried to land here, and the people wanted to disembark and move in America, but the United States government wouldn't allow them to land here in the United States. So these people were drifting around all over the big oceans in this boat, looking for a homeland as such, right? So the Western world has a guilt complex. The United States and England said they should have come to their aid earlier than they did in terms of fighting Hitler. So now you have this country of Israel created. And based on the writings of the Old Testament in their Bible, or in their scrolls, the Torah, they want to claim Jerusalem as the capital of this. They're saying it was the capital of ancient Israel, or the ancient Judea and Samaria, and so they want this to be their capital today. So hence we come to 2017 and Donald J. Trump. Again, with the whole world trying to mediate a peace accord between the Palestinian peoples and these European Israelis who moved to this area, trying to set up a place where there can be two countries here, Donald Trump takes the unprecedented step of agreeing with the most extreme of these European Israelis, and says the United States now recognizes that the ancient city of Jerusalem as the capital of this country called Israel. And in doing so, he has bucked the forces of the rest of the Western democracies. He's bucked the forces of the United Nations. He's bucked the forces of the quote-unquote moderate Arabs who were trying to find a way of finally coming to a peace accord for their region. So all by himself, he made a declaration, all right, which has the whole world gasping. What did Donald Trump just do? Well, what he just did was raise his profile on the international level to a very negative position. But by doing so, he's taken the pressure off of the American news industry in revealing more about his negative behavior as a man living in this society, as a candidate running for the presidency, and as a president. So what it is, again, it's the old sleight of hand movement. I'm going to do something over here and make y'all look at this instead of you looking at what I'm doing right here in this place. That's what Donald Trump has done. And again, the real tragedy in terms of what he's done, the real tragedy is yet to come, and that is the number of people who will be killed because of the uprisings that's going to take place because of this announcement. A couple of Palestinians, I think, were killed Friday. At least one was killed early this morning. You know, and I would think as long as this weekend and this continues, that the Intifada or this uprising is going to continue, and both, not just Palestinians, but both Palestinians and Israelis are going to lose their life just because of the unprecedented, irresponsible declaration of Donald J. Trump.
Well, all right, Brother Tehuti. I'm done with my questions, so if you want to take us on out, go right ahead.
Again, I just want to the peoples of the world who are fortunate enough to watch BABATV. Again, I want to just shout out to Baba and the work that he's been doing over the years. As I told him earlier, here's a new technology and a new way of using it. The world doesn't have to wait for BBC or NBC or CNN or Al Jazeera or any other of these well-funded news sources to find out what's going on. To get information from the street level, from the people's level of what's really going on, as opposed to information that's filtered through a bunch of editors and decision makers, I think you're doing a great job. And as I see the, I'm not a seer, so I can't see the future. However, as I think society is developing and moving forward, I see BABATV, I see Salnetta TV, I see Black News TV as new mechanisms for the people of the world to hear additional information and make up their minds about decisions that they're going to make. So my shout out is to you. My shout out is to Baba Salnetta in New York City. Hey, Baba. My shout out is to all the young people who don't have official organizational status or official titles given them by somebody else, who will step forward to the mic and give their opinion about today's affairs in the world with as much integrity and intelligence as anybody else. I think this is the wave of the future, and I just want to see what you're doing continue to grow and improve. Thank you very much for this time.